Hi everyone, it's Alex from Risk Academy, and it's a great pleasure for me to welcome you all at the fourth free Risk Academy webinar. And today I wanted to talk about risk management effectiveness and understanding how you, as head of risk, a risk manager, an internal audit, uh, a business leader, or an external consultant, can really get a grasp for how effective risk management is in any given organizations. And of course, because my experience comes from non-financial background, so I will talk about how to audit or validate or assess risk management effectiveness in non-financial companies. And before I do that, let me quickly introduce myself. Um, while I am doing that, let's do a quick technical check. If you can hear me okay, and if you can see the slides, please type in 2 pluses. If you can just hear, type 1 plus. If you can just see, then you wouldn't probably know what I've just asked. And once you've sort of typed in your pluses, and I can see that we don't have any major technical issues, please introduce yourself. Just say what's your name, where are you watching from right now. Usually there's a pretty global crowd on my webinars, and it's a great pleasure for everybody just to see where people come from. And if you feel like sharing what's your experience in risk or what's your role in risk, then by all means go ahead. It's always fun. So here are a few things about me. I've been in corporate risk management for 14 years. Most of the time I've spent in Australia and Russia. I did work for an extensive period of time in Poland and Kazakhstan. I have been doing a lot of training through my consulting work and as a head of risk of investment funds and venture capital funds. Um, both for the portfolio companies and for the senior management within the organization and for a lot of clients. Plus, I also teach at different MBA and executive MBA and corporate universities in Russia. And the trainings that I have been delivering, the different trainings, they've got awards in 2013, 14, 15 from the Russian Risk Management Association. I do currently look after most, if not all, of risk management training and certification for risk managers in Russia. Um, some of the work that I have been doing for one of the largest private equity funds in Russia, it was a government sort of semi-sovereign fund, was awarded Best CRM Implementation in 2014, and in the same year I was named the Russia's Risk Manager of the Year, which was very pleasant, and I'm grateful for the work and the team that helped me achieve that. I did do a lot of interesting things for the Auditor General's Office, for PwC Global, for Australian Stock Exchange, and as you're probably aware, because I try to publish it everywhere, I have a number of books, all of them on risk management, on the sort of the modern approach to risk management, and they're all available for free. You can get them on the Risk Academy website, and I'll share that with you as we go through the webinar. I have a lot of publications, articles, and small videos, all of which I encourage you to slowly but surely watch, because there's a lot of interesting, provocative, unusual ideas that you can find in those documents. That's a little bit about myself, and let's now reach out to you and ask you sort of the first question. When we are talking about assessing risk management effectiveness, what are some of the things that you think you may need to have a look at to make some sort of judgment? Like, what out of the choices that you will now see on the right of your screen in the comment section, there will pop up a little quiz for you. Which one do you think will provide most insight into the true effectiveness of risk management. Like, which one of those options would you, if you imagine a hypothetical, like if you only were allowed or able to request one document out of the list, which one would you ask for? Would you ask for risk management framework, or some reports, or the policy or registers, company performance reports, or board and executive meeting minutes? And I'll give you a few seconds to think about it and vote. And once the voting is finished, I'll show you the results, and we'll see how that matches up with some of the things I'll be sharing with you a little bit later. So I'll give you 5 more seconds. Good. So I'll close this now, and those are the results. You can see them. They're interesting. I'll come back to them a little bit later, maybe at the end of the video, once you had an opportunity to hear what are some of the messages I wanted to share with you today. And we'll see how that matches up. Well, I wanted to begin with a quick reminder and really just set the framework, or maybe framework is not the right word, but set the frame for our discussion today. And this is very important, because once you kind of accept this first challenge, everything else will kind of fall into part. It's like pieces of the puzzle that you need to combine together. But you first need to understand that it is in fact a puzzle. And the first real idea, or the first real message that I have been driving for years in the books, articles, videos, and literally anywhere I can possibly luckily, right now I don't feel that I am a crazy person anymore, because a lot of very respectable individuals have shared that message with me and have said exactly the same things, or along the similar lines. So the first message is very important, I feel, is that risk management objective is ultimately not about managing risks, but about integrating risk analysis or risk information into the decision-making and core business processes. Risk management, and I'll repeat that because this is fundamentally important, risk management is not about managing risks. The objective, or the idea, or the goal behind risk management is not to improve how you identify and assess and mitigate risks. That's not the business objective. In fact, probably no one in the company except the risk manager and maybe the internal auditor cares about mitigating risks. There's something completely different at play. And that something different is decision-making and core business processes. So risk management is ultimately about two things: changing how organization works and makes decisions, and changing how executives, line managers, junior staff think about uncertainty when they carry out their sort of day-to-day business activities. So that's the ultimate objective. But the key takeaway from this slide, and I've even highlighted it in a different color, is that it's easy to say risk management is about integrating into decision making, but it's actually very unique to every organization. I'd probably even say more than unique, it's very intimate to every organization how they actually do that. Because decision making in most businesses, especially strategic decision making, is not a very transparent process. It's usually behind closed doors, it's by a selected group of people, and it depends a lot on the personalities and the feelings of individuals. It's usually not a very structured, formalized process, unfortunately. And that's why you need risk management there, because intuitive decision making is probably the worst that can possibly happen in business. So that first message is really important. Risk management is about integrating into decision making, but more importantly, every single organization will do it differently. And that's why you can't really have a black and white approach to assessing risk management effectiveness. You should be looking for the 4 things that I will share with you in a second. But how those 4 things will actually look, will be very different from organization to organization. And I mean, in my career, over the 14 years, I have seen probably hundreds of organizations. And I have been responsible for integrating and implementing risk management in dozens. And I wish I could say I created something that I then just copy pasted from time to time, but it's not the case. Every single time you have to recreate something almost from scratch, because risk management is super basic. It's all about understanding what the risks are, analyzing what impact they have on a decision or a process or an objective, and then doing something about this. But technically, it actually turns out very different every time. So now let's have a look at the 4 things that I feel are important elements of assessing any non-financial organization's risk management effectiveness. So those are essentially the 4 things that you, as a risk manager, if you're doing an internal self-assessment, or if you're an internal auditor doing an internal audit of risk management effectiveness, or if you're an external consultant doing some health checking or benchmarking activity, those are essentially the 4 things that you need to look at. And if you've seen other webinars that I've done, you will recognize that I kind of try and squeeze in everything I talk about into 4 things. So clearly that's a little bit artificial. I just like the way 4 points look on a slide, and that's the real reason why there's 4 things. It could have been more. In fact, at the end of the video, I will share with you, and do stay along because you would want to see that that link. I will share with you the risk maturity model that has been recently developed by the G31000 community and recently was published, and it looks at the whole spectrum of risk management elements and examples of integration, and it sort of benchmarks or assesses risk management effectiveness against the 11 principles that are listed in ISO 31000. And when the new version of ISO 31000 will come out next year, it will be updated to reflect the 9 principles, the new number of principles in the document. But it is a model that I'm very passionate about and very proud. So I will share with you the link to find out more details about the G31000 model. But before that, I'll actually give you the answer to what needs to be done. And in case you will need more details, of course, you will be able to find it. But let's talk about the sort of the essence of how you test risk management effectiveness. And by the way, I always encourage you to write in questions in the comments section. As I like to say, risk management is not for shy people. So there's really nothing to be shy about. Do write questions. I encourage you. I will probably skip them as I go through the presentation, but what I will do is when I reach the end of the presentation, I will actually switch off the slides and switch on the camera, and we can have like a proper conversation. So I'll come back to every single question, or actually, well, I'll be honest with you, I'll come back to most questions, and I will respond to them. And if for some reason, outside of my control, I miss your question, I will most likely write to you in an email in a day or so after the webinar. So do ask away. And coming back to what I wanted to share with you today is there are essentially 4 fundamental areas or elements that you need to look at in any non-financial organization to make a judgment, an assessment on how effective risk management truly is. And the first one is probably the biggest one. It's decision making. To make an assessment on how effective risk management is, you need to start looking at how decisions are being made within the organization. And that includes decisions at any level within the organization. You can have a look at the board level, strategic decisions. You can have a look at investment committee level, investment decisions. You can have a look at budget decisions at the sort of a budgetary committee or executive management meetings, or you can have a look at any operational decisions that are made on a day-to-day basis and may or may not be formalized. And that essentially means looking at either the documents that have been prepared for each significant decision, or looking at the minutes of the decisions being discussed and taken, or talking to the people who have either prepared decisions or have been taking those decisions to understand something very simple. How much regard do they give to risk information? Do they make these decisions based on appropriate, transparent, timely risk analysis, or do they make those decisions based on intuition, incomplete data, and so on? And that is the biggest flag, the biggest indicator of what effective risk management truly is. So that essentially, and let me repeat that and make it sort of in a structured way for you. Essentially, what you need to be looking at when assessing risk management effectiveness and talking about decision making is fundamentally two things. Thing number one, you need to have a look at whether the requirement to think about risks have been formalized. Because it's one thing to say, just for fun, go and talk to any senior manager and ask them, do they consider risks when making important decisions? And of course, well, I mean, just seriously, go and do it. It will be fun. But I suspect that most of them will say, of course, we're thinking about risks when making decisions. Well, that's very fun, because that's actually a complete lie. Most of them do not think about risks at all. Some think of only a marginal risks that exists in every decision. And there's a lot of research behind that. So don't trust people just because they look senior and they say they think about risks, because there's actually a lot of research both in risk perception and risk psychology and cognitive biases, which give a number of explanations how people are actually not that good in thinking about risks when it's just sort of intuitive conversation type discussion, when it's not formalized, when it's not documented in any structured way. So people are fundamentally not very good at thinking about risks when making decisions. And second, there are a lot of hidden motivations, different influences by short-term bonuses, and many other corporate factors, not psychological, but corporate factors that really influence how people see or suddenly stop seeing important risks. So the first element that you really need to look at when we're talking about decision making is how well the requirement to have risk conversation is documented. Because if it's not, then there are very high chances that the discussion is either not happening at all, or happening really as a lip service, or, which is most often, happening but only talking about some of the more obvious risks, some of the risks that have happened before, something that's on the front of the agenda, but that really is just the tip of the iceberg. So the first element that you need to look at, well, how well that requirement is requirement to have a risk conversation when making an important decision is documented. And my guess is that it's not really well documented. And that's your first sort of, first tick, your first finding. That is a weakness. That is actually a very significant weakness, because if you don't really make people think about risks, they will not. They have other things to think about, especially, for example, making money for themselves. So that's number one. Within the decision making, you need to look at how well the requirement is documented. Number two is, of course, how well that requirement is actually fulfilled or implemented in reality. Does it or does it not happen? So that's when you look at decision papers, board meeting minutes, executive meeting minutes, supporting documentation for each decision. If, for example, like if in the investment management, if for every investment decision there isn't a proper good risk analysis attached to each decision that covers both the sort of subject or the project related risks and the portfolio related risks, then that's a good sign that those risks are not properly discussed, and of course they're less likely to be properly addressed as part of the legal agreements or contracts or the actual then implementation of whatever the project was. So those are the two things that you need to look at when we talk about decisions. It's how well the requirement is documented and how well is it carried out in reality. And generally, when we talk about decisions, you need to start looking at things like starting from strategic planning, some sort of from the very top, then going into budgeting, then going into operational planning, maintenance, marketing. It's really simple to say, but it's actually ridiculously difficult to do. Every decision where the price is high and the level of uncertainty is high, there should be some sort of element of risk management. Like every time uncertainty is high and it's not something trivial, it's actually costs significant amount of money, then there should be risk analysis. Like risk managers should be pinpointed there. So that's your first sort of big block of work, and that's tough. That's tough because people are not very diligent in documenting their decision-making processes. Just historically, so I guess, and it may require some work to identify the problem, and then to solve that you need to integrate into all of those key decision-making processes. So that's number one. Number two is culture. How well do people think, appreciate, and deal with uncertainty in the organization? And here you would look at a number of things, starting from competencies, KPIs, performance management, training, awareness, and just kind of conversations and communication that is happening within the organization. Now, there are quite a few elements that you need to be looking at. One piece of knowledge that is required to appreciate the true effectiveness of culture within the organization, of risk-based culture within the organization, is really understanding a lot of research behind cognitive biases, risk perception, and everything that is happening in human mind when they're faced with uncertainty. You really need to have a pretty, as a reviewer, auditor, or as an external consultant, you really need to have a good appreciation on that. And since that comes up often in my conversation as an important topic, and I have published, I think, at least 6 or 7 videos, short videos on different cognitive biases, I've decided to do the next webinar on the cognitive biases in risk management. So you'll probably find it useful. Stay connected in LinkedIn to see the link or the advertisement for that next free webinar. So the second element to look at is everything to do with people. And that is quite big because, risk management sounds simple, but it does require a lot of input from people. Even though in the first step, when I talked about decision making, I kind of didn't mention that you need to look at what different tools are used and how people switch from risk discussion, from like risk workshops and risk assessments in terms of likelihood and consequence, switch to proper decision-making tools, which are your decision trees, scenario analysis, sensitivity analysis, and Monte Carlo simulations. Those are the things that don't even mention the word risk. Yet they're much more powerful at analyzing risks than your simple likelihood consequence, bullshit. Luckily, I have a separate webinar on integrating risk management into strategic planning. So you can actually have a look, and on the right, I'll try and pop up a link for you to look at the webinar and register for the webinar on strategic planning and risk integration. That actually goes into a lot more detail on how you would actually integrate into decision making with an example of strategic planning. So if you've listened to my first point and you said, Alex, that sounds great, but I still have no idea what that means, well, that's because I have a separate webinar on that and a number of articles, as well as the book that you can also download for free. I've extensively covered those topics already, so you can find that information. Here on the second point, because a lot depends on the input from people and the interaction with people, a huge element of risk management effectiveness is how well those people are knowledgeable, versed in terms of risk management. And that's where all risk practitioners, auditors, and external consultants should be spending quite a lot of time just talking to people, understanding what's their risk perception, how seriously they take, do they see value, do they understand or do they fall into cognitive biases when making decisions, and so on. That is a hugely important element. The third one, and this is again quite critical, but it's actually much easier to validate and verify, is external reporting and validation. Actually, before I talk about external reporting, I think it would be fair to just mention quickly internal reporting, and it's part of the number one, decision making. To assess effectiveness of risk management, again, for example, you can ask for a quarterly or an annual risk report. And if you in fact get it, then that's a pretty good sign that risk management may not be as effective as you think. That's actually what I've just said is the contrary of what you were probably thinking. Existence of risk reporting is probably not a good sign unless there's something very specific about that organization, because just like everything else to do with risk, just like everything else, it has to be integrated into existing processes and existing decisions. That means instead of having a separate risk report to validate your effectiveness of risk management, you would have a standard performance report that the management presents to the board on a quarterly or annual basis. You know, the one that CEO presents, or the CEO or CFO. Or in fact, you may have all of these reports together. You may have one for CEO, one for CFO. And that risk information should be integrated into that. And when I say integrated, I don't mean the CEO talks about the first 5 slides and then on the 6th slide there's a risk map. We're saying, and these are our high risks. No, that's pretty rubbish as well. What I am talking about is when CEO is saying, we have achieved a margin of X, Y this year, this margin is already risk adjusted. It's calculated using our risk analysis formula, if I can put it in sort of for lack of a better word. Or, for example, if we're saying this quarter we have financed 5 projects, and out of these 5 projects, 3 were considered high risk. Or we are expecting, this is how our cash flow looks for 2019, and you can see that July is a particularly risky month because XYZ. So that's the kind of reporting that really should be happening in a mature, risk-effective organization. That's on the internal side. On the external, however, it's a slightly different story. Because when people from time to time ask me, how does risk management contribute to the effectiveness, or what value does risk management provide? And I always talk about 2 or 3 things. Thing number one, it significantly improves the decision quality, the quality of the decisions made within the organization. And the impact is huge, but the reality is no one cares. It's not really tangible that you make things better, that over time contribute to the success of the organization. Nobody gives a shit. It's just no one cares. So the reality is that there is a much simpler, more tangible value of risk management. Risk management can actually save you on insurance. It can save you on better financing costs if you're trying to attract loans or some external financing. And it can get all the regulators and prosecution and external auditors off your back. It's not a panacea by any means. It's not going to protect you, no matter what. But it actually has a very, very positive effect on the external sort of world surrounding the organization. And that's why I personally feel that external reporting and disclosure is very important, because it's a sign of mature organization, a sign of a very clever risk manager who knows what he's doing, because he is bringing all that value to the company. If you want to validate the effectiveness of risk management and you only see that it's some sort of internal thing and it's not in any way used externally to communicate with shareholders, regulators, investors, key suppliers. I mean, I've seen companies save millions on better supply prices because they were able to prove that they were good at managing their risks and their accounts receivables didn't have to be insured or something. So there's a lot of value in not only doing a good job internally, but shouting about risk management that you do internally at every single corner. It impacts on credit ratings. It impacts on a lot of positive things. So that's why when you look at how effective risk management is, well, saving money for the company is a very good sign of being effective. And that's why you would need to have a look at what sort of external reporting and disclosure is happening. Does the organization properly talk about and share what they do in terms of risk reporting? And the final thing that you need to look at to really get a grasp on how effective risk management is within the organization, and again, this is probably the least important of them all, but you still need to have a look at it, is the risk management team itself. Are they competent enough? Do they have sufficient knowledge? Do they have sufficient understanding of the business? Do they have the right set of competencies? And in the first webinar that I've run a while ago, and I think close to 2,000 people have now participated in my reruns of that webinar and the original one, I've talked about the 4 future trends of risk management. And I explicitly talk about the need for change for the risk management team. The role will change. Once you said risk management is all about decision making, then the role of the risk manager will change fundamentally. It will change so much that you would not be doing your quarterly risk workshops, you would not be doing your risk assessments, and pretty much most of the other silly things that we used to be doing many years ago. So it is important to have a look at risk management team, just how prepared they are for the future, essentially. And I encourage you to watch that webinar. Plus, I'll share the link to the video where I explicitly talk about the 4 things that every risk manager must know. I encourage you to have a listen to that short video on YouTube as well. So having a look at the risk management team as a final sort of check that all those pieces of the puzzle are in place, I feel is very important. So finally, to get an assessment or a validation of how effective risk management truly is, you need to have a look at a few things. First, you need to have a look at how well it is integrated into decision-making and core processes. How well is it integrated into reporting, into performance management? Are KPIs calculated with risks in mind? Are there specific risk KPIs for certain business units? How well the decision criteria is outlined? Is it with risks in mind, and so on. The second thing that you need to have a look at is the people of the organization. How do they talk about risks? Do they understand what risks they're dealing with? Why they're making certain decisions? Are they sufficiently competent? Because again, I'll just repeat that because this is very important. Just because a person is very smart and knowledgeable, that unfortunately doesn't mean he has sufficient risk management competencies. Thinking about risks is unnatural for humans. So unless, I say that with a caveat, because it is not unnatural for us to think about risks when we are faced with a life or death situation. Then we're actually not that bad. But even then, it's kind of touch and go, because a random individual in a life or death matter would be much worse off than a trained, for example, military individual who has been specifically trained on how to deal with emerging risks, very quickly emerging risks, and how to behave in the situation. So we're, as human beings, we're not that good at dealing with uncertainty. And there's a lot of science behind that. I mean, I always recommend reading the book by one of the Nobel Prize winners, Daniel Kahneman, which is called Thinking Fast and Slow. That's a good resource. And I'll actually, in the chat, I'll share with you the link to the article that I particularly like, because I've listed 8 books that I highly recommend reading for any sort of risk professional. So that's number 1, looking at the people and the culture within the organization. Number 3, sorry, did I say number 1? I meant number 2. Number 3 is looking at how well all this amazing stuff that's happening within the organization in terms of risk management is actually communicated to the rest of the world, because it can and should save company a lot of money. And if that's not happening, that's a good indication that risk management is not as effective as it could be, because it could be saving much more money for the organization. And the final thing to look at, which is less important than everything I've mentioned above, but still valuable, is to have a look at the risk management team itself to understand how competent, how well they understand the business, how well they understand the decision making, because realistically, I mean, the only reason why you would do an audit of risk management effectiveness is not to say everything is bad, but really to say everything is bad, but these are the things you can possibly do to fix it. And it is in a way about identifying the root cause of some of the problems. For example, don't be surprised that you will find that risk management is not systematically integrated into decision making. I mean, based on that logic that you see in front of you, I have conducted a very extensive research with Deloitte Russia on the Russian non-financial organizations. And out of 3, the maturity level was 1.3 or something, which is basically horrible, because level 1 is like when you have nothing. Level 2 is when you have your basic standalone risk management, which is all rubbish. And then level 3 is when you start integrating into decision making. So basically, most of the organizations I have seen recently did not even get to the low maturity. They're still at the stage where they haven't really even figured out where they need to integrate. So don't be surprised. And I mean, if you're thinking, well, that's Russia for you, it's not. Believe me, in most of the European and Western countries, it's even worse than that. Don't be surprised that you will find that there's no systematic way of integrating risk management and decision making, with maybe some positive examples, but overall it's probably not satisfactory. And don't be surprised that some individuals are very well versed in risk and others are completely ignorant and maybe even arrogant. And don't be surprised that there's not a lot of quality disclosure happening in your organization. That's actually not unusual. In fact, that's probably a very consistent picture around the world. And thinking of the root causes, well, unfortunately, most of the time, the root causes are the risk managers themselves, because they're so focused on doing quarterly risk assessments and writing beautiful risk reports and risk maps. And some dummies even use software to automate those risk maps, I mean, which is just stupid. That they don't have time to integrate into something that really matters. And it's kind of understandable, because integrating into something is really difficult. Just imagine approaching your CFO and saying, why don't we start budgeting differently to make sure risks are captured in our budgeting process? Well, I think you can imagine what the CFO will tell you. If he's a polite person, he'll say risks are already captured, which will be a lie. And if he's slightly less polite and less politically correct, then he may use other not very pleasant words for your approach. So looking at the risk management team is quite important, because most of the time they are the cause of the problem. They don't have the courage or the willingness and realistically the level of competencies to integrate into certain things. Because once you said you will want to integrate like Monte Carlo decision trees into the investment decision making, well, you actually need to understand how investment decision making works, which is one. And second, you need to have a pretty good corporate finance, statistical, and modeling experience and skills. That is not as simple as it sounds. So that's why I feel, fourth element is quite critical. Now, I did promise you to share the book with you that talks a lot about some of the concepts and ideas that I've been discussing. It is available absolutely for free. It's been downloaded more than 10,000 times now in English and 6,000 something times in Russian. So I suggest you at least have a look at it. There are a lot of links to the videos, and those videos provide slightly more provocative, interesting ideas. And another thing that I wanted to share with you, and this I'm quite excited about, I will now show a little link for you that you can click and find out more about the risk maturity model that G31000 recently published. Now, I find this very exciting, because at the high level, what I have described to you, the four sort of elements, that's all absolutely true. It is absolutely spot on. But you really need, or you may need, actual guidance and checklists and examples and sample interview questions and sample lists of documents to review and walkthrough questions and walkthrough ideas, and maybe like a little more guidance and as to what to actually look at when you, for example, trying to check for integration into procurement or integration into operational planning or into integration into maintenance. Or if you want to find out more about cognitive biases and what you need to be checking when assessing the effectiveness of risk training and million other things, there is a book. It's actually like a physical book of like 150 pages that has a lot of practical information and ideas and suggestions, which I think you will find very, very valuable and useful. And if you are planning to be in Dubai for the upcoming G31000 conference, you can get that book for free. So do have a look in the link. And now, I thank you very much for your patience. Thank you for the questions that were coming in. I will now switch on the camera and we can have a proper conversation, or I'll try and get back to you on all of the questions that you asked. Now, start posting your questions now if you haven't done already.